things that I do in the classroom, and I will tell you that I have spent every year of my adult life teaching history at West Springfield High School out in Fairfax County. And the course that I'm best known for teaching is a course that I designed 20 years ago called Applied History, where students work at historic sites and museums in the area such as Arlington House, Ford's Theater, Mount Vernon, Guxton Hall, Fairfax County Archaeology. It's a public history high school class. And since 2002, 33 of the students that have gone through that program have become National Park Service Rangers. It's been a great class to teach because it sort of frees up the creative side of it. I don't know how many of you follow public debates that take place regarding public education in the United States, but the standards movement, which really began about 20 years ago, has really put a crimp in the kinds of creativity I think we need to have in the high schools. Because of my approach to U.S. history, the applied history class has been actually a saving grace because it's allowed me to be my own boss and not be responsible to any kind of administrative team that has some bureaucratic angle to play in regards to the curriculum. So, and one of the things that I like about my writing, or the things that I am most proud about my writing, is that I involve my students whenever I write. So if you happen to pick up a copy this evening of Summers with Lincoln, every chapter but one has me on the road with students looking at Lincoln statues. And I guess maybe I should give you a little bit of background as to why Lincoln and why Lincoln statues. I grew up in the Catholic Church as a youngster in the years before Vatican II, and went to Catholic elementary school. And at that time, statues were a very big part of Catholic theology. And as a youngster, I was drawn always to Michelangelo's Pietà. And in 1964, we were living in New York when the World's Fair was held and the Vatican had their pavilion there. Word came out that the Vatican was going to loan for 2 years Pietà. And when my dad told me in 1964 that he was going to take me to the World's Fair, the very first place I wanted to go to was the Vatican Pavilion to see Michelangelo's handiwork. And I don't know, was anybody here? Did anybody here go to the World's Fair in 1964? Did any of you go to the Vatican Pavilion? Do you remember that wonderfully lit room that the Pietà was in with the ethereal blue light? There was a conveyor belt that carried you in and around. Well, I just kept going around.
You were that kid.
So, my public sculpture, I've always been drawn to it. And in 1989, when I began to incorporate the use of public sculpture in my classroom and my teaching, and I actually send my students into Washington here on what I call IFTs, individualized field trips, where they have to come and they have to look at monuments and they have to analyze them. It's not just go and see, it's figure it out. It's look at what it says. It's read the clues that are there. And whether it's them going to see the masterful copy of Augustus St. Gaudens's Shaw Memorial in the National Gallery of Art, or whether it's going out and looking at the monument project, what I call Echoes from the Mall, starting in World War II, going to Korea, Vietnam. I really, really believe that teaching here in Washington, D.C., right here is the great laboratory of democracy, and our students should be in the laboratory of democracy, studying history and doing history to learn history, because I don't think history is a static subject. I think it is dynamic, I think it changes, I think it's fluid, And that's been one of the great things about teaching the last 30 years is that there's been so many changes that have taken place in historiography and how we approach the subject matter that it's been a great joy to impart what I feel is my continuing journey as a learner with my students, who obviously I hope that they then will continue the journey in their own lives. And whether they go on and become park rangers or not, at least I'd like them to think that, I'd like to believe that they will continue to read history, maybe not for a vocation, but perhaps as an avocation. So what I'm going to do with you tonight is sort of take you through the journey that I did for about 5 years. As I was sharing at the table, this book was really supposed to be a chapter. And I really wanted to write a book called Who Do We Think We Are? A Journey into America's Monumental Landscape. And I convinced my wife in 2002 that could I have 2 weeks of summer vacation to go look at Lincoln statues, because I could write a book proposal and a chapter on Lincoln statues. And so I took off and headed out. And after a week on the road, I would go visit the monument. I'd go to the local library, the Historical Society. I'd dig around the archives. I'd interview people. And I'd go back to my hotel room and I'd sit and type all my notes. And at the end of 1 week on the road, I had 100 pages of single-spaced notes. And I realized at that point that it was not a chapter, but it was a book. And the timing couldn't have been better because the Lincoln Bicentennial was in the not-too-distant future. So I immediately shifted the focus from all of American history to Lincoln. And there are, as of today, more than 225 Lincoln statues in the United States. That number continues to grow. A third of them are located, not surprisingly, in Illinois. Of that number of 225 and growing, there are only 5 in the states of the former Confederacy. And depending on who you talk to, they may not count. When I was in Gettysburg, when the book came out in 2008, I did 3 days of book programs in Gettysburg, and I was in a store up there and was selling my book, and into the store ambled this lean and mean Civil War reenactor from Mississippi. And he looked at my book and he looked at me, and I said, yeah, I know, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be standing here. I got this kind of strange look on his face. I started talking to the person next to me, and one of the websites I like to surf is called findagrave.com, where you can look at famous graves of famous people. And I was talking to this woman, and this guy was eavesdropping, and I'll tell you what he said at the end, but then he said to me, he said, how many of these Lincoln statues are there in the states of the war of the Southern Secession? And I don't know if you know this, but if you go out to Arlington National Cemetery and you look at the Marine Corps Memorial, that memorial, which was dedicated in 1954, in order for that memorial to be created, the word Civil War could not appear on the litany of wars in which the Marines took place in. Congress would not authorize it unless it said the war between the states. So if you go out there and you look at the chronological sequence of all the wars starting from the American Revolution in which the Marines have participated in, you get to 1861, it's wars between the states. But anyhow, this gentleman proceeded to ask me where these statues were, and I said, well, he said, there's one at Vicksburg National Military Park. Don't count. That's federal property. Right? I said, well, there's 2 in Tennessee. Where in Tennessee? Well, there's 2 at Lincoln University in Harrogate. He said, don't count. Union sentiment in that part of the state. I said, okay. They said, well, there's the last one. He said, there's one in Richmond, Virginia. Oh, that one don't count at all, because that one's in the sacred cradle of the Confederacy, and we're not going to have Mr. Lincoln there, so that statue really doesn't count. There are 4 statues in the states of the former Confederacy. There's 5 if you count one in Oklahoma. There's a Lincoln totem pole in Alaska, and there's a Lincoln statue on the island of Oahu. outside the Eva, what was then in 1945, it was dedicated to Eva Plantation School. It is now the Eva Elementary School, and it's a statue by Avert Fairbanks, who did a number of Lincoln statues across the country. So that sort of just gives you a geographic framework of where the statues are. What I ended up doing was looking at about 45, and I limited my search to monuments to Lincoln that were erected or created by men who were born in the 19th century. And I focused on monuments that were erected during the great age of Lincoln Monument building, which is roughly about 1876, starting here with the Emancipation Monument in Washington, and then ending roughly around 1932. Those monuments, of that 45 that I looked at and studied, 7, I would argue, are the most important Lincoln statues for either their artistic merit or for their place in the Lincoln mythology, in the development of the Lincoln story. Part of the other reason was that why these 7 ended up is, like any historian, you need a paper trail, and these monuments provided a paper trail. The others that are in the appendix to the book did not have the rich kind of archival material that one could use to pull the story together, because what I really wanted to touch on was not just Lincoln, but what the people who created the statues believed about Lincoln and how their beliefs came through the interpretation of Lincoln. And then what did those statues mean to the people at the time they were dedicated? And what do they mean to us today? What do these bronze and marble effigies that we've placed to the 16th president say to us today? Whether it's here in Washington, D.C., standing at the foot of Daniel Chester French's majestic figure in the Lincoln Memorial, or in Fort Wayne, Indiana, standing in front of Paul Manship's Lincoln the Hoosier Youth. Monuments, I believe, are great teaching devices. In fact, the German word for monument is Denkmal, which means thought object. And really, monuments were created, and this goes back to antiquity, monuments were created as conversation pieces. They were meant to elicit discussion and dialogue. We've lost that to a certain extent today because we don't, we put up a sculpture, a public monument, it gets its initial attention, and then that's it. But in the late 19th, early 20th century, people went to parks and they walked around these things. And monuments were meant to be viewed from all angles. They're not meant to be viewed, unilaterally. So if there's anything tonight that you leave by discussion from is to understand that there's a variety of ways of looking at monumental sculpture, both in terms of what it means today, what it meant when it was created, and what it meant to the sculptor. So I'm going to take you through the journey of that I went on, and let's see. Okay, where do we go, Karen? Do I need to go to my computer?
No.
Down here in the corner.
And then just do the little slideshow down in the lower right-hand corner. Or the left-hand corner, right there where Buzz is at.
Over here.
Yeah. Under his mask. Keep going. Keep
Shoot
going.
Buzz.
Up,
Shoot
up.
Buzz.
Okay.
There you go.
There's 700 different ways to do these things, I swear. So anyhow, you're going to see my odyssey of uncovering Lincoln's identity through these monuments. And I will say that one of the great joys of working on this book was to be able to work with an outstanding litany of Lincoln scholars and come to really understand the sort of brotherhood there is in the Lincoln community regarding his place in who we are as a nation. And so, let's see this. Okay. All right. The statues on this list comprise 7 important public sculptures erected to the memory of Lincoln. And here we have a picture of Lincoln taken shortly after he was elected to the president, nominated for the Republican candidacy of the presidency. And here we have a picture of Lincoln taken several years later in November of 1863 here in Washington, D.C., shortly before he delivers his Gettysburg Address. What are the main themes of Lincoln sculpture? And I settled, the book had to address, each statue had to address at least one of these themes. The youthful Lincoln, the president-statesman, the commander-in-chief, the man of sorrows and contemplation, or the great emancipator. When you look at Lincoln sculptures, or any sculpture, what are the questions you want to consider? What themes does each sculpture address? What emotions does each sculpture pull from you? Because an artist, it doesn't matter, it makes no difference if that artist is a painter, is a sculptor, is a performing artist. They're trying to draw something out of you. They're trying to make you feel something. So what emotion do you get when you walk away from this statue? Why do you think the pose that was chosen was selected? And then, which of these resonates with you the most? I always ask my students, when we look at monuments, and I do it all the time in my American history class, which of these tells you, as you see it, the story of event X, Y, and Z? To really understand Lincoln sculpture, you really need to understand this guy and the story of his creation of the Lincoln life mask and the Lincoln hands. This is Leonard Volk, and you can see Volk's handiwork if you go to the National Museum of American Art or the National Portrait Gallery, whichever building it happens to be housed in at the moment. They have the original mask that Leonard Volk took of Lincoln in March of 1860 in Chicago. And Volk actually was hounding Lincoln for 2 years. Leonard Volk is by marriage a relative of Stephen A. Douglas, and today, whereas we have a commercial as politicians, getting their story spread by commercials, if you were a politician who had arrived in the 19th century, you had a portrait bust of yourself done. And the hope would be that the sculptor would then sell multiple copies of that portrait bust so that you would be in the homes of your potential voters. And it took Lincoln a while to warm to that idea, but in March of 1860, on a Saturday, he goes to Volk's studio in Chicago, and he goes through the grueling process of having two reeds put up his nostril, his eyebrows covered with oil, his hairline covered with oil, 2 gauze pads put over his eye, and then Volk then proceeds to layer on layer after layer after layer of plaster, and Lincoln has to sit for 90 minutes with this thing hardening on his face. And then Lincoln, after 90 minutes, Volk and Lincoln wrestle the mask off. It pulls Lincoln's eyebrows out, not all of them, but you get where I'm going. Lincoln actually tears up, and Volk has a negative mold. And in the next week, Volk then takes the negative mold, coats it with wax, pours plaster back into it, and then Lincoln shows up in his studio a week, 2 weeks later to look at it. And what we have is the Lincoln life mask, and Lincoln's comment, there's the animal himself, when he looks at the face. And one of the things when Lincoln as a subject for any artist, whether it was a photographer, whether it was a painter, he was a difficult subject. Sculptors had a problem because his face is cockeyed. There's an odd slant to the face this way. He's got most people don't realize unless they're really deep into Lincoln lore that he was kicked in the head when he was a child, almost died. He's got a funny lip. He's got a big nose. He's got a mole on one side of his face. His face was difficult to get, but sculptors that were able to utilize the Lincoln life mask are the ones that came up with the most successful and probably most enduring sculptures of the 16th president. And I will argue that 2 of the men on the list, George Gray Barnard and Gutzon Borglum, I believe they felt they had some sort of mystical, spiritual bond with the mask. Because once the mask is made available to the general public, copies are made and reproduced, and artists are buying them up to use. And Barnard and Borglum write heavily about the influence of the mask on their artwork. Now, the first important Lincoln statue is this statue here in Washington, D.C. It's not the first statue of Lincoln in Washington, D.C. The first statue of Lincoln in Washington, D.C., depending on whether you're talking about inside or outside. Some people would argue the first statue in Washington, D.C. is the statue by Vinnie Ream that's in the Capitol Rotunda. Others on the outside would argue that it's Lot Flannery's statue that's outside the old Washington, D.C. City Hall. This is the first, I would argue, is the first important Lincoln statue. Now, I will not say that this is necessarily a great statue in an artistic or an aesthetic way, but I will say that it is crucial in understanding Lincoln mythology and in understanding the story of race in American history. The monument is actually called the Emancipation Freedmen's Monument. And if you go to Lincoln Park and you stand in front of it, you will see Emancipation is right down on the bronze plinth. That's because the statue was paid for exclusively by African Americans. Freedmen, African American veterans of the United States Colored Troops gave money to have a statue to Abraham Lincoln erected. However, they had no say in over what the design would look like. Needless to say, as I point out to my students, that no sculptor in his or her right mind would ever venture to pull off a statue like this of Abraham Lincoln. And as we look at the statue, I want you to consider that of that 225 statues of Abraham Lincoln that are in the United States, only 9 of them include an African American figure. I would argue that the next great Lincoln statue, or the next important Lincoln statue, needs to be a statue of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass together. There is I believe there's a sore need for that, because I think that's a story that's increasingly being fleshed out, and I think it would make an important piece on the public sculpture landscape. Frederick Douglass gives one of his great speeches here in April of 1876 when the statue is dedicated. That's another reason why this sculpture is important. The artist is Thomas Ball. Thomas Ball, like many American artists of the mid-19th century, was an expatriate American. He traveled to Europe for his training. There was no American Academy of Arts. He's from Boston. If you're familiar with the city of Boston, he did a marvelous statue to Charles Sumner in Boston. But Thomas Ball settled in Florence, Italy, and his studio he called Villa Ball. And when the men who had the money for this, they were the Western Sanitary Commission out of St. Louis. When they held the money for the African American community, they were the ones that then went out and decided, what are we going to pay? And not unlike monuments that go up in Washington today, monuments in Washington in 1876 were no stranger to controversy. And there's a good reason. I think controversy is good because it gets out that great debate that we have about who we are and what we mean when we say we're Americans and what do these things say about us. The debate over this statue was more really, I think, over an issue that I think is important, and that is the issue of self-emancipation. The first sculptor to bid on this, if you even want to call it a bid, was Clark Mills. And Clark Mills is best known in Washington for his statue of Andrew Jackson across the street from the White House, and the statue of George Washington up on Washington Circle. Clark Mills is also the man whose foundry cast the Statue of Freedom for the top of the United States Capitol. What most people don't know is the men that worked that foundry were enslaved African Americans. Right? Clark Mills, a guy with, not unlike many artists, had a big ego, came up with this huge, huge design that was going to have Lincoln at the top, seated at his desk, signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Beneath that were going to be the great statesmen of the Civil War. Beneath that was going to be scenes of emancipation. And then at the bottom were going to be the four great generals who arguably won the Civil War: Grant, Sherman, Thomas, and Sheridan. And while that project was just going to cost way too much money, it never became a reality. The second person to play into the scene was a sculptor from Boston by the name of Harriet Hosmer. And I think that is an interesting story because that memorial was going to show African Americans in the role of self-emancipation. It was going to show Abraham Lincoln, recumbent, lying in state, and around him were going to be allegorical figures of African Americans in the act of emancipating themselves. For whatever reason, whether because Hosmer was a woman, whether it was because they didn't like the idea of blacks having any role in freeing themselves, that got scrubbed. And finally, one of the members of the Western Sanitary Commission is in Florence, goes to see Thomas Ball, happens to see a reduction of the statue in bronze in the corner, and strikes on this as a great monument, the ideal monument that we want. Ball had never intended this to be a public monument. It was a parlor piece, but nobody's going to turn down to have a public monument in Washington, D.C. in such a prominent location. So Ball eagerly was willing to create and make it larger in clay and then send it off to the foundry in Munich, Germany, where it was cast and then dedicated here on a wonderful day in April 1876. And speaking at the dedication was Frederick Douglass. Now, as part of my research, I went out and figured out the parade route for this parade. The procession was 2 miles long. The parade started with Frederick Douglass in the lead carriage, open-air carriage, started where the NPR building is today, headed downtown, came across the White House grounds, up Pennsylvania Avenue, and then ended at what is now Lincoln Park, where waiting there was President Grant, members of the Supreme Court, the diplomatic corps, and members of Congress. Also in town that day were thousands of African Americans and their fraternal organizations who literally marched in that parade to see Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, unveiled. Now, Frederick Douglass is interesting when you look at Frederick Douglass because shortly after Lincoln was assassinated, somebody asked Frederick Douglass what Douglass believed about Lincoln. And in 1865, Douglass said, Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the black man's president. 1876, he's changed his tune to Abraham Lincoln was neither our man nor our model. He was preeminently the white man's president. And I think you have to understand that in context of where Douglass is now in 1876, seeing where the nation is headed. Reconstruction is coming to an end. They know that the country is changing. People are beginning to push back against Lincoln as the great emancipator. In fact, there's a huge shift in 1887 where that image of Lincoln as the great emancipator is replaced with Lincoln the great statesman. And the man that's responsible for doing that, not deliberately, is the great American sculptor St. Gaudens, who I'll address in a moment. These are some archival views of the statue. And they actually, when the statue was first unveiled, it faced the Capitol building. In 1976, as part of the bicentennial, and with the inclusion of the statue to Mary McLeod Bethune by Robert Burks on the other end of Lincoln Park, the statue is turned around to face that, to face Lincoln facing Mrs. Bethune. These are pictures taken from roughly about 1900. This actually was taken shortly after the dedication, this one about 1900. Lincoln holds in his right hand a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. His hand rests on a metaphorical podium representing the presidency with a bas-relief medallion of George Washington. Thomas Ball would argue in his autobiography that the enslaved figure is in the act of rising, not in bowing of homage. But if you don't know that story and you're just looking at it cursory, it looks very different. But if you look closely at his hands, you'll see a broken shackle. If you walk behind the statue, there's a broken lash and a whipping post that is being covered over with vines and a cloth. But by 1903, a version of this had been given to the city of Boston. Used to stand in Copley Square. They've moved it off to the side. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois referred to this as the shoeshine statue, for obvious reasons. And again, I would think artistically, it's not a great statue. I was really tempted when I wrote my book to grade these as A, B, C, but I decided not to. But I would put this in sort of like the B- category, if you would peg me on it. But it's important because of the place in the story of Lincoln and Lincoln iconography. The second statue is in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it is the handiwork of Paul Manship. And you know Paul Manship primarily from one piece of art that always appears on TV at this time of year. Paul Manship did the statue of Prometheus that sits above the ice skating rink at Rockefeller Center. Paul Manship also has a statue here in Washington, D.C. to Theodore Roosevelt that is over on Roosevelt Island, which is often referred to as the windmill Theodore Roosevelt, because of the way the arms are positioned. Manship was not a sculptor of historical or biographical personages. He was principally an artist of allegory, animals, but in 1928 he's approached by Lewis Warren and the Lincoln Historical Association in Fort Wayne to do a statue. He's actually approached by the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company, which is now the Lincoln Financial Group, which is now in Philadelphia, to do a statue. And he gets $75,000 for this. And if you wanted to be a sculptor of renown, you needed to have a Lincoln on your resume. So Manship jumps at this, and he signs a contract. His studio's in Paris. He comes to the United States. He's an American. He's a New Yorker. Comes to Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana. He travels around with Lewis Warren, whose collection would become the basis of the Lincoln Museum of Fort Wayne, which is now housed in the Indiana Historical Society. And he travels, and he tries to really tap into Lincoln. And he finally decides at Nancy Hanks Lincoln's grave in southern Indiana, Lincoln's mother, that he gets his inspiration, that this is a desire to represent the young Lincoln as a dreamer and a poet, rather than as the rail splitter was uppermost in my mind. And you can see, here's Manship with his full-size plaster version in his studio in Paris. And you can see, this is a huge statue. This is, heroic in size. Manship will give us not an Art Deco kind of interpretation of Lincoln. And what it shows is Lincoln in the moment of changing from manual labor to intellectual pursuits. You have Lincoln having placed the axe down at his side. He's picked up a book. He's looking into the future. This is Lincoln rejecting his frontier roots, rejecting essentially his father's way of life, and looking to the future. It's a youthful Lincoln. Why is there a dog in the statue? Well, there's a dog in the statue because Manship wanted a dog in the statue. And Manship in Kentucky said he found a Lincoln-like hound. And he bought this dog and brought it with him to his studio in Paris and incorporated the dog into the statue, principally because he had heard from reading William Herndon that Lincoln had saved a dog in the Wabash River as the family was moving across from Indiana to Illinois when Lincoln was 20 years old. And so he puts him into the statue. He also is pretty sneaky because down below he gets to play around with these sort of metaphorical, allegorical images. On the base, you have 4 allegorical figures representing different traits of Lincoln's personality. I mean, these are called manships medallions. So you have an eagle representing patriotism. You have a mother and her children representing Lincoln's traits of charity. You have a Greco-Roman wrestler with a Greek column seated astride a subdued lion representing Lincoln's fortitude. And then you have a figure of justice representing Lincoln's attitudes towards justice and his law profession. Now, one of the things about these monuments is, since most of these monuments were dedicated in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, not only were they monument ceremonies dedicated to Lincoln, the Commander-in-Chief, but these were ceremonies dedicated to the veterans of the Civil War. These photographs were taken on the Friday, September 16th, 1932, and up on the platform up here are aging Union Civil War veterans. There are actually 4 people on the podium, on the rostrum, who met Abraham Lincoln. They found a guy, 104 years old in Michigan, who had met Lincoln. They paid for his ticket. They brought him in. He was seated there, as was an 85-year-old woman by the name of Mrs. O.O. Smith, who, as a 15-year-old child, had sang for Lincoln as part of the children's choir at the dedication of the National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You can also see down here is the newsreel cameras capturing this. You know, radio was new in 1932, and this was carried live across the country. Telegrams poured in to Fort Wayne, to the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company from all over the country, congratulating the community. Schools shut down for a day. There were seminars for children that were held. This was a big deal. And you also have to remember, this is in the Farm Belt in 1932, in the worst year of the Great Depression. And look at that crowd. 8,000 people packed into downtown Fort Wayne to witness this dedication. It's incredible. It's incredible the draw here for this. And one of the things I like to do is I like to take kids places. The best place for me to teach is not inside my classroom, it's somewhere else. Because somewhere else is where history happened. You can stay in room 255 at West Springfield High School and I can tell you about history, but I can't show it to you there. So I take you there, and several years ago we did a Lincoln pilgrimage during spring break and did Lincoln sites between Ohio and Springfield, Illinois. And these kids actually gave up their spring break to travel with their quirky history teacher to go look at Lincoln. But it's the best kind of teaching, and I think the best kind of learning that there is. All right. In 1917, we have this sculpture to Abraham Lincoln by the American sculptor George Gray Barnard. Now, this sculpture is interesting because I would argue that one of the first great art controversies in American art history takes place with this statue. And it's really over, what does Abraham Lincoln mean to us? It doesn't matter what the statue looks like, but what it is who is Lincoln for us? And part of the problem here is that this sculpture was originally supposed to be only for Cincinnati, Ohio. The man that was the sculptor, George Gray Barnard, like Manship, was not a sculptor of historical figures. He was an allegorical sculptor. His best known work are the 2 entrances of commerce and labor that are outside the portals of the entrance to the Pennsylvania State House in Harrisburg. The family, you have to also remember, this is the City Beautiful movement, which was kicked off in 1893 by the World's Columbian Exposition. Cities are competing with one another for attention. You want to be a city on the map, you want a statue of Lincoln. So President William Howard Taft's older half-brother, Charles, wealthy philanthropist from Cincinnati, gives Manship $100,000 to create this statue of Lincoln. Manship believes he is giving Abraham Lincoln the man of democracy. This is the man, this is Lincoln the Democrat. This is Lincoln who is one of us. Now, the story would have ended there, and people could have carped about what it looked like. But the problem was that the Tafts got over their head in this, and Manship let his ego get in the way. Because, look at the date, 1917. The Taft family decides we're going to give a duplicate cast of this statue to all the capitals of the Allied nations that are fighting against the Germans in World War I. We're going to give one to St. Petersburg, we're going to give one to Paris, and we're going to give one to London. Now, the controversy erupts. And the controversy erupts is this the Abraham Lincoln we want to see exported? Is this the Abraham Lincoln we want standing in front of Parliament in England? It was a huge argument. The man who led the attack on the statue was a man, a second-rate sculptor by the name of Frederick Wellington Ruxtell, who was editor of a magazine called, it was called Art World, a magazine dedicated to the beautiful. It came out every 2 months. Between January of 1917 and January of 1918, Ruxtell hammered Barnard on his interpretation. And it got from attacking the art to, by 1918, attacking the man. It was really personal, and it was really, really ugly. Ruxtell brings into the argument Robert Lincoln, who is horrified by the statue. Robert Lincoln is absolutely mortified. In many ways, he's angry because Lincoln never wore shoes. Lincoln always wore boots, and Barnard missed it there as far as the son was concerned. The son had problems with ears. He had problems with the Adam's apple. Barnard then goes out and hires his people. He brings into the argument Ida Tarbell. He brings the biographer. He brings into the argument Edward Markham, the great Lincoln poet of the early 20th century. And this war goes back and forth, back and forth. Finally, and I read all the editorials. By the last editorial, Ruxtell in 1918 is saying, blow the damn thing up with dynamite. Okay. Eventually, this statue did not go to London. But another statue did, the St. Gaudens statue. But this statue has, I think, a very fitting end piece. It does go to England, and it's dedicated in 1919 in Manchester. And it's in a park in downtown Manchester, looking at another statue, and that is the statue of John Bright. John Bright was the leader of the Manchester Textile Union. In 1863, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, in solidarity with the enslaved African Americans, the Manchester textile workers shut down voluntarily in solidarity with the African Americans in the South. Lincoln and Bright would correspond. Manchester is also the ancestral home of the Lincoln family. One of Volk's portrait busts ended up in the church where the Lincoln family, who were Puritans, worshipped before they came to Massachusetts in 1636. So the statue does have a fitting ending. This was Barnard. Barnard, his letters are really interesting because he would talk about writing friends that he couldn't wait to get up in the morning and finish shaving, because then he would go out and he would caress the mask, and he would commune with the mask, and he would really get into the Lincoln spirit with the mask. And he said, an imaginary Lincoln is an insult to the American people, a thwarting of democracy, no imitation tool of any artist's conception, but the tool of God and Lincoln made Lincoln's self. And here's the sculpture in Lytle Park in March of 1930, 2 weeks before the United States enters World War I. And it is the first time in which Lincoln's memory is invoked as a use of history to justify why the United States needs to go to war against the Hun. And as I said, the press and culture wars. This is a cartoon that appears in a magazine showing these are other famous Americans that had Barnard created them. That's what they would look like. This is Washington. This is Webster, Longfellow, Grant, and Farragut. Okay? And then this appeared in a British journal. Here's John Bull, not very happy with the Barnard statue. And then we went to the statue on the road trip in 2007, and it just so happened that it coincided with the meeting of the Association of Lincoln Presenters. We actually we stayed in the hotel where they stayed at. It was great. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. The next statue on the list is by James Earl Fraser, Lincoln the Mystic, fitting into the category of Lincoln as the man of sorrows, man of contemplation. What's interesting about this statue is the sculptor, James Earl Fraser, was Augustus St. Gaudens's #1 assistant, #1 student, and I believe drew inspiration for this figure from the sculpture that he did here in Rock Creek Cemetery for Henry Adams and in tribute to his wife, Marion Hooper Adams, which is mistakenly called Grief. That's what we know it as. It's not what it's called, nor was it intended to be known as Grief. But I believe that Fraser drew his inspiration from this. And this is actually at the easternmost terminus of the Lincoln Highway in Jersey City. Now, I want to make sure I'm on safe ground here, because I heard somewhere in conversation tonight that this is the oldest meeting Lincoln group in the country. Is that true?
Well, oldest continuous meeting.
See now, the Jersey City, the Lincoln Association of Jersey City argued that they go back to 1866.
Yeah.
So I'll just stay neutral on that
There
one.
are a lot of lawyers.
But it's what's interesting about New Jersey is New Jersey has 4 statues of Lincoln, and the state didn't even vote for him in either 1860 or 1864. But also what's interesting, there are 2 ways of looking at New Jersey. Somebody pointed this out to me. If you actually look at a map of New Jersey, 1/3 of it, geographically, is below the Mason-Dixon line. New Jersey was a hotbed of secessionist sentiment during the Civil War. The other interesting, and I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but they like to tell this in Jersey City, that in 1864, the brother of John Wilkes Booth, Edwin Booth, saved Robert Lincoln from being hit by a train in the railroad station in Jersey City. I don't know if that's, they'd love to tell that story in Jersey City. It's maybe apocryphal.
Yeah, no, he did actually pull Robert Lincoln
Back
from
from
the
the
train.
train.
Whether Lincoln would actually have fallen in front of the train or
Right.
died otherwise is problematic, but there actually was.
There was actually an event there. Lincoln actually did visit Jersey City on his inaugural trip in 1861, and then went through the city again when he went to West Point to visit with General Scott. The president of in 1930s, Howard Cruse and Fraser corresponded, and Fraser wrote, "It is a thought I have had in mind for some time, and I believe it a little different from any statue of Lincoln which has produced." Now here's the problem with this statue. Both Howard Cruse and James Earl Fraser argued to the day they died that this was President Abraham Lincoln. Now, what's the problem?
No beard.
There's no beard. But it didn't matter to them because this was the essence of Lincoln, and that's what they were trying to get at. But I think you have to be hard pressed historically to say this is President Lincoln if he doesn't have a beard. I have a real problem with that. Here's the statue today as it sits on the eastern terminus of the Lincoln Highway. There's a bench behind it, which in artistic parlance is known as an exedra. This would be known as a destination monument, meaning you need to go into the monumental space to understand the sculpture. Around the base of the statue are 36 stars representing the 36 states in the Union at the time of the Civil War. And then I came up with this interesting quote. Everybody who had a Lincoln statue dedicated, when you look at the local papers, their Lincoln statue was the best one the country ever had. It's amazing when you look at that. And so J.O.N. Grundy, who attended the dedication when he was a 13-year-old boy, said this was truly a people's tribute to a man of the people, and the vast outpouring of the populace of that June day bore testimony to the widespread enthusiasm. As the great cloth covering fell away, It revealed what experts have proclaimed as one of the finest and most magnificent memorials, notes the qualifying, in bronze, Abraham Lincoln to be found anywhere. There's no way he's going to compete with Daniel Chester French's statue of marble here in Washington, D.C. These are some close-ups. One of the problems that sculptors had with Lincoln were the legs. How do you get the legs right? And that was very difficult for artists. The other statue that's in New Jersey is, of the four, two of them are in the book, is this one in Newark, New Jersey. And it's one of 3 statues of Abraham Lincoln that was done by Gutzon Borglum. Now, Borglum is, do any of you know anything about Borglum? I mean, he's a character, okay? He's a racist, he's a xenophobe, he's got the ego the size of Mount Rushmore. I mean, any man that's going to conceive of a monument that size has got to have an ego. He joins the Ku Klux Klan, he dabbles in civic affairs, he dabbles in aviation, and I do believe he was a genius. I believe he was a dark genius to a certain extent because he actually would lobby behind other artists' back and try to undermine commissions that they would have for Lincoln. For example, when Daniel Chester French is appointed, essentially appointed by the Lincoln Memorial Commission to be the sculptor of the figure of Lincoln in Henry Bacon's temple, Borglum goes off the deep end. And he was not a man to mince words. I will give you his story. 1928, he goes out to South Dakota to carve Mount Rushmore, begin the process. Okay? He invites then-President Calvin Coolidge to watch the first drilling on the side of the mountain. He drops off the side of the mountain, he drills into the side, he comes down, he gives the president the bits, and he asks the president, he says, Mr. President, I would like to erect an entablature on the side of this mountain, and I would like you to write that entablature for me, to tell us the story of America. So Coolidge is honored, he goes back to the White House, he writes this out, he sends it to Borglum. Borglum takes it, goes through with a pen, rewrites it, sends it back to the president with a note saying, Dear Mr. President, I rewrote this the way you meant to say it. Okay. There's a letter in the Borglum papers here at the Library of Congress. It's a copy of a letter from Coolidge to a friend that says, please keep as many miles between me and Mr. Borglum. But that said, Borglum as an artist got it right every time he did Lincoln. Whether it's the Lincoln that used to be in the rotunda of the Capitol, the large marble portrait bust that is now in the basement of the Capitol building, or it's this which was done in 1911 in Newark, New Jersey, or the face of Lincoln on Mount Rushmore. Borglum got it right. He knew Lincoln inside and out. He was so enamored with Lincoln that he named his only son Lincoln Borglum. This sculpture was originally meant for the centennial of Lincoln's birth. It is dedicated in 1911 in Newark, New Jersey, and it's actually owned by the Essex County. Here's a picture of Borglum. You can see sort of the fiery, smoldering presence that he has, with the model of the statue in his New York City studio. And Borglum, if you ever want to read a really great magazine article from 1910, Borglum wrote a magazine article called The Beauty of Lincoln that appeared in a magazine called Everybody's Magazine, which was essentially the Good Housekeeping magazine at the turn of the last century. And it's a wonderful article. And he was the other artist that I believe had this mystical bond with the mask, because he said, I do not believe there ever was a grotesque Lincoln. You will find in his face literally all the complexity of his great nature. And he measured them. If you read the article, he talks about how he measured the mask, he felt the mask. It's quite an interesting piece of writing. Here's the dedication, Memorial Day, 1911. Here you can see the sculpture shortly after the American flags that have been in front of it have been pulled away. Here is the speaker's rostrum. Speaking as the keynote speaker was Teddy Roosevelt. And again, apocryphally, Roosevelt claims that when he dedicated this statue is when he decided to put his hat back into the ring for the presidency in 1912. Here's a close-up of the sculpture, and I love this line of Teddy Roosevelt. This is what Roosevelt says at the dedication. "You have done it. You have commemorated here in fit form one of the two greatest statesmen that this country has ever had." And I'm not so sure he's thinking about himself. One of that very limited number of great men whose greatness is for all the world and for all ages. Teddy loved to go to Lincoln statue dedications. He was enamored with the 16th president. The one thing about Lincoln that I've learned through this whole process is that how everybody gravitates to Lincoln. It doesn't matter what political side you're on. It doesn't matter what country you live in. Lincoln is a universal figure who attracts a lot of people from a lot of different causes. And people use Lincoln's words. The Chinese love Lincoln. They love Lincoln. And there's a reason they love Lincoln. It has nothing to do with communism and capitalism or anything like that. It has to do that the Chinese believe that Lincoln embodies Confucian ideology. Lincoln is seen as a great unifier and a man of harmony. And that is, whether you're Chiang Kai-shek's people or whether you're Mao's people, those traits are part of Chinese culture. And so Lincoln is absolutely adored in China. If you ever go to Tiananmen Square, okay, they will tell you Mao's mausoleum. It's based on your great Lincoln Memorial. And it is. You stand outside Mao Tomb and you look at it, it is a carbon copy almost of the Lincoln Memorial. You go to Taipei and you go to the shrine to Chiang Kai-shek, you see Daniel Chester French's statue with Chiang Kai-shek's head on it. Okay? I mean, the posing, everything, it's all there. This is a man by Osborne H. Oldroyd. He, at 73 years old, he's a veteran of the Union Army. He hiked the 211 miles between here and between Washington and Newark to pose. His collection became the basis of the collection at Ford's Theater. Here's Jackie Robinson in 1952 on Lincoln's birthday, putting a group of flowers at it. Now look at this picture. It was somebody else who had a problem with this statue. The other person that had a problem with the statue was Robert Lincoln. In 1917, Robert Lincoln wrote a letter to a friend who said, "It is used as a playground by the hoodlum children of the neighborhood." Okay? Those look like real hoodlums. The Newark Public Library has a wonderful collection of images of this statue. The collection is just priceless. The sixth statue on the list is this statue in Chicago by the great American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, and it is this statue that literally, by virtue of its pose, changes our perception of Lincoln from great emancipator to great statesman. Now, this is not Lincoln in the moment of delivering the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural. Okay? Anytime Lincoln gave a public speech, he always had his speech in front of him. What St. Gaudens attempted to accomplish here was to capture the essence of the man. And where St. Gaudens as a sculptor is genius, is St. Gaudens has the power to give bronze life. If you stand in front of this statue and you study it, this thing looks alive. It has a seminal kind of energy. All of St. Gaudens' great statues, and he did 40 public monuments, of which 5 are masterpieces. They all have an energy. And to be able to, in bronze, pull that off is incredible. And what St. Gaudens has is he's picked Lincoln at a moment where Lincoln is just about to speak. Okay? And he's given Lincoln the chair of state, but the chair of state also serves as an artistic device because it provides volume for the sculpture. Because if we didn't have this chair there, the figure would get lost. But the chair provides that space. If you also look here, the foot is coming off the pedestal. St. Gaudens was genius at that, getting the figure to look as if it was moving. And what we have here is St. Gaudens plumbing the depths of Lincoln's humanity. Now, here's the monument in Lincoln Park, outside what used to be called the Chicago Historical Society, but it's now the Chicago History Museum. It's another destination monument. You have to go up into the exeger space. The monument, the pedestal and arrangement was designed by Stanford White, the great American architect. He and St. Gaudens collaborated on over 20 pieces. Laredo Taft, a sculptor and the great American art historian, said, standing before it is like standing before the soul of America. And there's a great tale with this statue. The Great Chicago Rail Strike, the Pullman Railroad Strike, in 1892. Chicago is convulsed. Walking from Hull House is a confused, struggling Jane Addams. She's supporting the labor movement, supporting the strikers. She walks the 2 miles from Hull House to stand at Lincoln's feet, to ask Lincoln, what would you do in this crisis? She gets her inspiration from that. The man in Chicago who is running and managing the Pullman Railroad strike, Robert Lincoln. Now, if you ever want to go to a historic site that's a hidden gem in this country, take yourself to New Hampshire and go to St. Gaudens National Historic Site. It's an incredible place. It's wonderful. It's bucolic. And it's a great place to learn about St. Gaudens and his art. Now, St. Gaudens goes to New Hampshire in 1885 because his friend, the lawyer Charles Beeman, says, Gus, you must go to New Hampshire. You must go to northern New England. It is the land of Lincoln-shaped men. And so St. Gaudens in 1885 rents this ramshackle down tavern, turns it into a studio, eventually buys it, and he puts a newspaper ad out, and looking for a model to serve as the Lincoln figure. And this guy, Langdon Morse, from Windsor, Vermont, answers the ad. Now, Morse posed for St. Gaudens for 2 summers. Morse grew the beard after the fact, once he's certified a Lincoln guy. But the statue is actually created in Cornish, New Hampshire. And St. Gaudens was an incredible perfectionist. He actually got a suit like that Lincoln would wear. He would have Morse tromp around the fields outside the converted studio to get the fold in the pants right, to get the vest right. Morse became somewhat of a local celebrity because of it. St. Gaudens fiddled around with all kinds of designs. You know, sculptors start out in clay with what they call a maquette and work out the problems in the maquette. Here you see, Lincoln with a speech. Here you see Lincoln with his arms folded, different poses, finally settling on the one that you see in the statue. This is a picture of St. Gaudens, who is 6 feet tall in his own right, in his studio with the full-size clay model. You go from clay to plaster to bronze. The clay model eventually is destroyed in the process. Okay? And so you have this wonderful photograph of St. Gaudens in his studio in New Hampshire. And this, what I really like about this picture is this is the only known photograph of the dedication of the Lincoln statue on October 28th, 1887 in Chicago. It was found about 10 years ago in Australia. Some collector found it in Australia, and the guy that eventually bought it gave me the permission to use it in my book, and didn't even want any recognition of his name. He just said you can use it. And it's argued that this is St. Gaudens and his wife up on the podium, up on the rostrum. But if you ever get a chance to go to Chicago, take yourself out to Lincoln Park to look at this. It is a stunning, stunning piece of work. And this is the statue that eventually went to London in 1921, dedicated by David Lloyd George, right across from Parliament. And then finally, we have arguably the greatest monument to Abraham Lincoln's memory, the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington, D.C., the temple based on the Parthenon turned on its side at the western terminus of the mall, with Daniel Chester French's magnificent statue of Abraham Lincoln, the commander-in-chief, inside the chamber. Had St. Gaudens not died in 1907, St. Gaudens would have been the man to have done this. In fact, in 1901, when the McMillan Park Commission came into Washington and sort of redrew the mall, based on L'Enfant's plan, it was St. Gaudens that drove the stake into the ground where the Lincoln Memorial stands. And had he died, he was only 59 when he died. French is 70 when he creates this. I think if St. Gaudens had not died, he would have been the sculptor of choice. It's kind of sad because Mrs. St. Gaudens, who maintained her husband's legacy, actually wrote a letter to Henry Bacon insisting that they make a bronze version, larger bronze version of the statue in Chicago for inside the chamber. And again, like all monuments, this monument was fraught with controversy. Former Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, at the time that they drove the spike or the stake into the ground, said, "I'll be goddamned if they'll put a statue of Abraham Lincoln on that goddamn swamp." And then in 1922, he sheepishly tells former President Taft and members of the Lincoln Memorial Commission, "Well, I guess you boys got it right." So but what you have is Lincoln, 22 separate 2-ton blocks of Georgia marble. Again, depending on who you talk to, Lincoln, the way French has it in his papers is that Lincoln's right hand is open, showing his closed rather as a fist, showing his strength to preserve the Union. His left hand is open, showing his compassion, his flexibility, his generous terms of Reconstruction. Some people will argue that it's also Abraham Lincoln, French putting sign language on Lincoln's hands, and Lincoln is signing the letter A and L. Now, there could be a merit of truth to that. There's nothing in French's papers that says that. But in 1885, Daniel Chester French, as a young sculptor, did a statue for Gallaudet. It's the statue of Thomas Gallaudet signing the letter A with his student Alice Cogswell. Okay? French knew American Sign Language. The man who signed the charter for Gallaudet was Abraham Lincoln. So one could parenthetically argue, I think, maybe, that, okay, we've got a dissenter in the room.
It's a myth.
Well, I would argue,
It's a myth. That is not an A and an L in sign language.
well, let me tell you this. The American Sign Language teacher, every time I walked past her in the hall, would say, "Mr. Percola, you have it wrong. You're spreading rumors about sign language." You're welcome. I would say that those who argue that the back of Lincoln's head is a portrait of Robert E. Lee looking back through the wall at his beloved Arlington house. I think that's a stretch. But I'm willing to buy into those people that. Do you speak sign language? Do you sign?
No, but we all know it's an urban myth, an urban legend. We just know it.
Yeah, this is A, this is L.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just throw that out there to.
Would you please not spread that myth?
If you read the book, I say in the book there's nothing in his papers that say that. But I am willing to parenthetically believe, as a sculptor, French understood that. So I'm willing to at least
Think about.
think about it. I'm willing to think about it.
The problem-
See, I told you controversy. Always controversy. Here's French in the studio in Chesterwood, Massachusetts, and Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And if you ever go to another great historic site, Chesterwood is a wonderful historic site in Massachusetts, run by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. This is French and Bacon inside the chamber of the memorial. Originally, French was going to have this statue in bronze. And when they got the chamber completed, they took a photograph and enlarged it to 11 feet and brought it into the chamber. And French and Bacon realized that it was too short. They also knew that to get it right, they had to go to 19 feet. But to do it in bronze at 19 feet would have been cost prohibitive. So French paid out of pocket to do it in marble. And it was actually carved in the Bronx by the nation's premier stone carvers, the Piccirilli brothers. And it was shipped by rail to Washington, down 23rd Street, actually down along the mall. A railroad line went into the Lincoln Memorial, and it was lifted by block and tackle and placed and assembled inside the memorial chamber. What I think is important, and again, above Lincoln's head, in the words of the artist, the art critic Royal Cortez, who wrote an early biography of St. Gaudens, he says, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he preserved, saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." Now, this statue, this memorial, was never to have anything to do with emancipation. The Lincoln Memorial Commission squashed any effort to have emancipation part of this. In fact, the man who spoke, the keynote speaker at the dedication, Robert Moton, the heir of Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute, his speech, now you gotta remember, this is 1922. It's an awful period for African Americans in American history. Lynchings have spiked. Post-World War I is awful. There are race riots exploding throughout parts of the United States. In 1909, there's a race riot in Springfield, Illinois. It's terrible. Moton writes a speech that is rather, in the perspective of the folks who are the Lincoln Memorial Commission, antagonistic. They tell him, you must rewrite your speech. This is too inflammatory. We are not about rubbing salt in old wounds. The compound matters. When the statue is dedicated, and here are the hands, but we'll go fast by that. Let me get to
Wasn't
this.
that
This is what's in Francis Leonard Bacon in 1915. I wanted to convey the strength of the man and the confidence in his ability to see the job through. But Warren G. Harding, who spoke at the dedication, said that this memorial, matchless tribute that it is less for Abraham Lincoln than for those of us today and for those who follow after. Now, invited to the dedication on Memorial Day, 1922, are 75 African American dignitaries. They all have tickets. They have been invited. 1922, Washington, D.C. is a segregated city. They arrive, they get to the seating area, and they are told, we're sorry, you are African American, or you're black. You must sit at the back of the crowd because this is a segregated community. 21 of them walk out. The rest of them are escorted to their seats by a Marine corporal who is dropping the N-word all over the place. That is reported in the story of that is in the Washington Afro-American newspaper that appeared the week after the dedication. Now, interestingly, the Lincoln Memorial is not, in my estimation, just a memorial. It's a place of history and memory as well. In 1939, Marian Anderson, who was denied permission to sing not only at DAR Constitution Hall, but she's also denied permission to sing at a DC public high school. On Easter Sunday, 1939, gives a performance outdoors to an integrated crowd of 75,000 people. Mary McLeod Bethune writes the dean of Howard University Law School, Charlie Houston, a letter the next day and says, our time has arrived. With the Marian Anderson concert, our march to freedom will begin. Scholars of the civil rights movement are now beginning to look at the modern civil rights movement beginning with this event and not necessarily the 1954-55 Brown v. Ward, Montgomery bus boycott. As you may know, Eleanor Roosevelt resigns from the DAR over this controversy. President Roosevelt gives permission for Marian Anderson to sing here at the memorial. In fact, he tells his Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, Harold, if she wants to sing from the top of the Washington Monument, she can sing from the top of the Washington Monument. 1963, we have Martin Luther King Jr.'s great speech, the March on Washington. Several years ago, there was a controversy that Dr. King's speech, how are we going to remember this speech? How are we going to mark this speech? There was great debate in the Park Service as to how to do this. Some people wanted to have a plaque put up on the same level that where Dr. King spoke at. The person who put the nix on that was Coretta Scott King. She said, no, it must be at the place where my husband spoke from. Our problem was, how do you do this without compromising the artistic integrity of the work? That's a big issue. You know, how do you do these changes to a work of art that already exists? Well, was a gentleman in the Park Service by the name of Glenn DeMar, and Glenn came up with a brilliant idea. You can really only see the inscription that was incised into the place where Dr. King gave the speech when you come down the steps of the memorial. And in doing so, what you are is you are standing in Dr. King's footsteps, looking out over the mall as he did in 1963. Interestingly, the Lincoln Memorial has also been a place of movie sets. 1939, Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The same year, Marian Anderson is denied permission to sing at DAR Constitution Hall. In 1939, the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington premieres at DAR Constitution Hall. And Frank Capra argued in his autobiography, The Name Beneath the Title, that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is a movie about Abraham Lincoln, and that the moral core of that movie rests in the memory of Abraham Lincoln. And how many of you have seen the movie? Okay. I would ask you to go back and look at, because I think there's a moment in the movie where America's racial ambiguity is very evident. It's the scene where Jimmy Stewart gets off the train here at Union Station, and as he's exiting the door and ends up going on that tour bus that takes him eventually to the Lincoln Memorial, you see two African American porters, and they're very stereotypically portrayed, sort of in what is called the Mambo style, and there's a lot of shucking and jiving going on. But then, when you get 2 minutes later into the sequence where Jimmy Stewart is in the chamber, as this little boy and his grandfather are reading the words of the Gettysburg Address off the wall, when they get to the term New Birth of Freedom, into the chamber walks an older African American man. And there's a 2-second splice of his face when they get to the word freedom. And I would argue, in that 2 minutes in which Frank Capra has gone from stereotype to homage, I think you see in the 1930s America's racial ambiguity played out in that scene. I think it's very evident. And so if it's been a while since you've seen the movie, look at the scene. It's really kind of stunning when you put the pieces together. Finally, in 1915, Daniel Chester French wrote a letter to his good friend Katrina Trask. He had done a statue in honor of her husband in Saratoga Springs, New York. And he said, "I have lived with Lincoln so long that I feel as if he were a personal friend. And in the time that I spent with Lincoln and learning about Lincoln and monuments, I can understand how he feels." Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be happy to take any questions.
So actually, we're running a little late, so
Okay.
I think we have time for a couple of questions,
Okay.
almost literally a couple.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Have you studied many other international statues? Do you know about the one in Kathmandu?
No, I know I know the one in Mexico City. There's one in Moscow. I'm not familiar with the one in Kathmandu. I will Google that. I will Google it.
Is there one in Paris?
No.
No, I didn't.
No, there's one in Washington in Paris by French, but not Lincoln.
That tells us something about the French. Second question. Yes, in back, yes, sir.
Does this iconography fade with the Great Depression?
Yes.
World War II and the Cold War?
Yes.
And Hoover becomes the face of the Republican Party on this whole
Yes,
period?
and it also fades with the fact that Civil War veterans are dying, and the living link to the Civil War is no longer there. I would argue we have some good Lincoln statues that have been created since then, but I don't think we have great Lincoln statues that have been created since then.
James, thank you very much. We do have to vacate here. It was some trepidation that I give you a statue of Lincoln.
I got a high five from guess who? My wife. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.